Welcome, friends. Before we delve into today's tale, let us know in the comments where you're joining us from on this journey. The vast expanse of the Texas plains, in the waning years of the 1860s, was a land of stark beauty and unforgiving truths. It was a place where the sky stretched like a boundless canvas of blue, and the wind whispered secrets through the tall grasses, secrets of survival, of loss, and sometimes of improbable destinies. Here, amidst the silence broken only by the cry of hawks and the rustle of unseen creatures, lived Sarah. Her small, sturdy cabin, built with the loving hands of her late husband, John, stood as a solitary monument to a dream that had been cruelly curtailed. John had been taken by the fever 2 winters past, leaving Sarah to navigate the currents of grief and the harsh realities of frontier life alone. She was a woman forged in sorrow, her slender frame belying an inner resilience as unyielding as the ancient oaks that dotted the landscape. Her days were a testament to quiet fortitude, tending the small garden, checking the snares John had taught her to set, mending clothes by the dim light of a tallow candle, each task a repetition, a meditation, a clinging to the familiar in a world that had become terrifyingly unpredictable. The homestead was her only anchor, a repository of memories both precious and painful. She moved through her chores with a grace born of necessity, her eyes, the color of a storm-gathered sky, observant and missing little. She noted the shift in the wind's direction, the way the prairie dogs tense before a dust storm, the distant, almost imperceptible smoke signals that sometimes painted faint questions against the horizon, reminders of the Comanche, the people, whose land this had been for generations, and whose presence was a constant, unspoken tension in the fragile existence of settlers like herself. Her grief for John was a quiet ache, a companion that walked beside her, yet she did not succumb to despair. Instead, she had learned to listen to the land, to understand its moods and its offerings, a skill honed in the crucible of her solitude. The earth beneath her worn boots was both a comfort and a challenge, a promise of sustenance and a reminder of all she had lost, and all she still fought to protect. One sweltering afternoon, with the sun beating down mercilessly, Sarah ventured further from her cabin than was her usual habit. A feeling of unease had settled upon her that morning, a subtle discord in the familiar symphony of the prairie. She carried her husband's old rifle, more for a sense of security than any expectation of using it, its weight a familiar pressure against her shoulder. She was tracking a small stream, hoping to find fresh water and perhaps check a distant line of snares. The air was thick and still, heavy with the scent of dry earth and sun-baked herbs. It was near a treacherous bend in the shallow, mud-choked creek, where the ground turned deceptively soft and miry, that she heard it, a sound that cut through the oppressive silence, a sound that spoke of desperate struggle. Her first instinct was fear. Every settler knew the stories of the Comanche, of raids and retribution. Her hand tightened on the rifle. But then, another sound reached her, a strained cry that was undeniably young, laced with terror. Caution warred with a deeper, more elemental instinct. She crept forward, using the sparse cover of willows, her heart hammering against her ribs. There, caught fast in a clinging, viscous patch of quicksand, was a boy. A Comanche boy, by his buckskins and the single feather tied in his dark hair. He couldn't have been more than 12 or 13 summers old, his face contorted with fear as he fought against the sucking mire, sinking deeper with every panicked movement. For a long moment, Sarah remained frozen, the ingrained fear of his people battling with the immediate, undeniable sight of a child in mortal peril. His dark eyes, wide with terror, met hers, and in that instant, he was not a Comanche, not an enemy, but simply a life on the verge of being extinguished. The memory of her own losses, the raw empathy that her grief had not dulled but sharpened, surged through her. She laid down the rifle, her decision made. She knew this ground, John had warned her of these treacherous patches. "Hold still," she called out, her voice surprisingly firm, though she doubted he understood her words. He thrashed again, and the quicksand greedily pulled him further down, up to his chest now. She quickly scanned her surroundings, her mind racing. A fallen cottonwood branch lay nearby, heavy but long. With gritted teeth, she dragged it towards the edge of the mire, her muscles straining. The boy watched her, his struggles momentarily ceasing, replaced by a dazed bewilderment. Pushing the branch out towards him, she urged him with gestures to grab hold. He hesitated, suspicion and fear still clouding his young face. But as the mud gurgled around him, a fresh wave of panic spurred him to reach. His fingers closed around the wood. The pull was immense, the quicksand reluctant to release its prey. Sarah dug her heels into the more solid bank, her breath coming in ragged gasps, every fiber of her being concentrated on the effort. Slowly, agonizingly, she began to draw him towards safety, the thick mud yielding with sickening reluctance. Finally, with a last, desperate heave, he was free, collapsing onto the firmer ground, trembling and covered head to toe in the clinging muck, utterly spent. Sarah, panting, sank to her knees beside him, her own strength nearly exhausted. The boy lay there, his chest heaving, his eyes closed for a moment. He was slight, but wiry. As he coughed, spitting out mud, he looked at her, a dawning awareness in his gaze, a flicker of something other than terror. She offered him her canteen, and he drank thirstily, his eyes never leaving hers. The language barrier was a chasm between them, yet in the shared experience of life narrowly saved, a fragile, unspoken understanding flickered. She gently helped him to sit up, noting a finely beaded amulet around his neck, half hidden by the mud. It was intricate, clearly of significance. A chilling thought struck her, this was no ordinary boy. His attire, though simple, spoke of care, of status. As she cleaned some of the mud from his face with a corner of her apron, she saw the high cheekbones, the proud set of his jaw, even in his weakened state. He was clearly of important lineage. A wave of apprehension washed over her. This act of mercy, she instinctively knew, would have consequences that rippled far beyond this muddy creek bank. She helped him to his feet, he was weak but could stand. Supporting him, she began the slow journey back to her cabin, the silence between them heavy with unspoken questions and the looming shadow of an uncertain future. The sun was beginning to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, a deceptive peace settling over the land. Back at the cabin, she gave him water to wash and a spare blanket to wrap himself in while his buckskins dried by the small fire she kindled. He watched her every move, his dark eyes intense, no longer fearful, but deeply observant, much like her own. As dusk settled, casting long shadows that danced with the firelight, the inevitable arrived. The rhythmic drumming of unshod hooves approached, too many to be a lone rider. Sarah's heart leaped into her throat. She moved to the door, her hand instinctively reaching for the rifle, then hesitating. The boy, Kachi, as she would later learn his name, tensed, a low sound escaping his lips. He knew. A line of formidable Comanche warriors emerged from the twilight, their painted faces stern, their lances glinting. At their head rode a man whose presence radiated authority, his gaze sweeping over the small cabin with an intensity that seemed to pierce right through the log walls. It was Chief Kachi. He dismounted, his warriors fanning out behind him, a silent, menacing crescent. Sarah stepped out, placing herself slightly in front of the doorway, a small, solitary figure against the might of the Comanche nation. Kachi's eyes found her, then shifted to the boy who now stood in the doorway behind her, wrapped in her blanket. A flicker of emotion crossed the chief's stoic face as he saw his son, relief, undeniable and profound. Chief Kachi's gaze, hard as flint, moved from his son, Kachi, back to Sarah. For a long moment, no one spoke. The air crackled with unspoken tension, the only sounds the chuffing of the warriors' ponies and the chirping of crickets, suddenly overwhelmingly loud in the silence. Kachi stepped forward slightly, murmuring something in his own tongue, his hand gesturing towards Sarah, then towards the creek. Kachi listened, his expression unreadable. He was a man in his prime, tall and powerfully built, his face a mask of weathered resolve, etched with the burdens of leadership. He understood his son was alive because of this solitary white woman. But this was Comanche land, and she was an intruder, one of the people who were steadily encroaching, changing the ancient ways. One of his warriors, who seemed to understand some English, stepped forward. The chief, Kachi, asks how his son came to be here with you. His voice was guttural, laced with suspicion. Sarah, keeping her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, recounted the rescue, her words simple and direct. She pointed towards the creek, miming the struggle, the quicksand. As she spoke, Kachi's eyes never left her face, as if searching for any sign of deceit. When she finished, there was another heavy silence. Then, Takori spoke, his voice deep and resonant, carrying the weight of command. The warrior translated, "He says you have saved the life of his firstborn son, his heir. This is a great debt. A life for a life." Sarah's blood ran cold. What did he mean? She could only nod, her throat too dry to speak. Takori continued, his words relayed with stark finality. "The spirits have shown their will. You were there. You saved him. Such a debt cannot be repaid with trinkets or horses. You will become Kachi's wife. You will become one of us. This is the only way." Sarah stared, stunned into disbelief. Marry the boy? Become one of them? The world tilted, the firelight blurring. "No," she whispered, then louder, her voice shaking but firm. "No, I cannot. I am a widow. My husband, my life is here." She gestured to her small cabin, the garden, the symbols of her existence. "I saved your son because he was a child in need." "I ask for nothing." Takori's expression hardened. "Your wishes are not the concern here. The debt is the concern. The honor of my family, of my people, is the concern. My son lives because of you. Your life is now bound to his." The warrior added, his tone ominous, "To refuse the chief is to refuse life. Your small patch of land, your life, it is all forfeit if you do not accept." The choice was no choice at all. It was an ultimatum, delivered with the unyielding force of a people who understood survival in its rawest terms. Her heart cried out for John, for the sanity of the world she knew, now ripped away by this impossible decree. She looked at Kachi, who watched her with wide, uncertain eyes, clearly as taken aback by his father's pronouncement as she was. He was just a boy. And she, a woman who had already buried one life, was now being forced to step into another, utterly alien and terrifying. The plains, once a place of solitary peace, now felt like a closing trap. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The weight of Takori's decree pressed down on Sarah, suffocating her. The crackling fire, the impassive faces of the warriors, the vast, indifferent night sky, all seemed to conspire against her. She thought of John, of the vows they had made, the simple life they had carved out together. To marry another, a boy, a stranger from a world so utterly removed from her own, felt like a betrayal beyond imagining. Yet, the alternative was starkly clear in the glint of Takori's eyes, in the unyielding stance of his warriors. Her small homestead, her very life, hung in the balance. It was a bitter draught, this choice, a slow death of spirit in an alien world, or a swift, physical end here, under the silent stars. Her mind raced, seeking an escape, a loophole, but found none. This was not a negotiation, it was a declaration of terms by a power far greater than her own. Survival, raw and unadorned, was the only imperative that remained. With a profound weariness that settled deep into her bones, a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion, she gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Her voice, when she finally found it, was barely a whisper. I will do as you say." There was no triumph in Takori's expression, only a grim acceptance. He spoke a few curt words to his son, then to his men. Two warriors stepped forward, not unkindly, but with an air of finality, to gather her few essential belongings. She was allowed to take a small bundle, a spare dress, her mother's worn Bible, and a tiny, intricately carved wooden bird John had made for her one spring. Each item felt like a fragment of a shattered life. The journey to the Comanche encampment began under the cold light of the moon. Mounted on a pony provided for her, she rode amidst the warriors, a captive in all but name. The familiar landscape around her cabin, the only home she had known in this vast territory, receded into the darkness. With each hoofbeat, she felt herself being pulled further away from who she was, from everything she held dear. The world transformed around her. The open prairie, once a symbol of freedom and solitude, now seemed a boundless prison. The Comanche warriors moved with a silent, fluid grace, completely at home in the wilderness that had always felt, to her, like something to be tamed and guarded against. The Comanche winter camp was a sprawling collection of teepees nestled in a sheltered river valley, smoke curling from their peaks into the crisp morning air. The sights, sounds, and smells were an assault on Sarah's senses, the barking of dogs, the cries of children, the scent of wood smoke and roasting meat mingling with the unfamiliar aroma of herbs and tanned hides. As she was led through the bustling camp, every face turned towards her. Stares followed her, a mixture of unveiled curiosity, suspicion, and, in some, outright hostility. She was the white woman, the outsider, brought into their midst under strange and compelling circumstances. She was taken to a small teepee set slightly apart from the others, its entrance flap tightly closed. This was to be her new home. Kachi, who had ridden silently beside her during the journey, was immediately surrounded by his family, drawn into the warmth and familiarity of his own lodge. Sarah was left alone, the flap dropping behind her, plunging her into a dim, unfamiliar space. The silence within the teepee was profound, a stark contrast to the vibrant life outside. For the first few days, she existed in a kind of daze, a stranger adrift in a sea of alien customs and an unintelligible language. Food was brought to her, usually by a stern-faced older woman who would leave it without a word. Sarah ate, not because she was hungry, but because she knew she must. She spent hours observing through the small opening of her teepee, watching the rhythms of Comanche life. The women, their laughter carrying on the wind as they worked hides or tended fires, the warriors, their movements conveying strength and purpose, the children, their games echoing the skills they would one day need to survive. It was a world complete unto itself, a world that had no need of her, yet had claimed her. A profound loneliness settled upon her, heavier than any she had known, even in the depths of her widowhood. But beneath the fear and despair, the core of her resilience, tempered by years of solitary struggle, began to assert itself. She was a survivor. She would watch, she would learn, she would endure. Her observant nature, once a comfort in her solitude, now became her most vital tool for navigating this new, bewildering existence. She began to pick out recurring words, to associate gestures with meanings, slowly, painstakingly piecing together the rudiments of their tongue. Kachi, meanwhile, recovered quickly from his ordeal. He was young and strong, and the care of his mother and the camp's medicine woman soon had him back on his feet. From a distance, he observed Sarah. He had not forgotten that he owed her his life. There was a debt, as his father had decreed, but there was also a burgeoning, reluctant curiosity about this quiet, pale-skinned woman who had faced down his fear and the quicksand with such strange calm. He saw the suspicion she endured, the isolation. He was a chief's son, and a sense of responsibility, however unwelcome, began to stir within him. One day, a small child in a neighboring teepee fell gravely ill. A burning fever consumed him, and the medicine woman's chants and poultices brought no relief. The child's cries grew weaker, and a hush of concern fell over that part of the camp. Sarah, hearing the distress, felt a familiar pang. She had seen such fevers before, back in her old life. She knew the cooling properties of willow bark, a remedy her own mother had taught her. Hesitantly, she approached the teepee, a small bundle of dried willow bark, gathered from near her old cabin and kept in her meager possessions, clutched in her hand. The child's mother looked at her with distrust, but also with the desperation of a parent watching her child fade. Sarah, using the few Comanche words she had learned and many gestures, tried to explain. The medicine woman, a formidable figure with eyes like polished obsidian, regarded her with open skepticism. It was Kachi, drawn by the commotion, who intervened. He spoke to his mother, then to the medicine woman, his voice earnest. He gestured towards Sarah, then towards the creek where she had saved him. He seemed to be vouching for her, suggesting she be allowed to try. Reluctantly, the medicine woman nodded. With trembling hands, Sarah prepared a tea from the willow bark, a simple infusion she had made countless times. She offered it to the child, coaxing him to sip the bitter liquid. Hours passed in tense silence. Then, slowly, miraculously, the child's fever began to recede. By morning, he was weak but out of danger, sleeping peacefully. A collective sigh of relief went through the camp. The child's mother looked at Sarah with newfound gratitude in her eyes. Even Corey, when he heard, gave a curt nod of acknowledgement. It was a small thing, a whispered change in the wind, but for Sarah, it was the first fragile thread of connection in this alien land. She had offered something of worth, something from her own world, and it had been received. The time for the binding ceremony arrived with little fanfare, yet with an inescapable weight. It was not a celebration as Sarah might have understood a wedding, but a solemn, practical ritual that solidified her place within Kachi's life and, by extension, the tribe. It took place within Takori's large teepee, witnessed by his immediate family and a few elders. Sarah wore a simple buckskin dress, provided for her, feeling like an imposter in clothes not her own. Kachi stood beside her, young and serious, his face betraying a mixture of duty and apprehension. He too was a pawn in his father's decree, his youth now tethered to this stranger. Takori spoke, his words deep and authoritative, outlining the responsibilities and the bond being forged. There were no vows exchanged in her tongue, no tender words, only the stark reality of their new, shared existence. An elder offered prayers to the spirits, smoke from sacred herbs filling the air. Sarah felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if watching herself from a great distance. This was not a marriage born of love or even choice, but of obligation, a life raft in a stormy sea. When it was over, she was Kachi's wife in the eyes of the people. They were led to a teepee that was now designated as theirs. The first nights and days were filled with an awkward silence, a palpable tension. They were two strangers, bound by an unbreakable decree, yet separated by a chasm of culture, language, and experience. Kachi, perhaps sensing her fear and unhappiness, maintained a respectful distance. He began to teach her more of his language, pointing to objects, naming them, his voice patient. She, in turn, showed him the pages of her Bible, not for conversion, but as a relic of her world, the strange markings of her own tribe stories. She mended his hunting shirt with neat, practiced stitches, a skill that transcended language. Slowly, tentatively, a fragile truce began to form between them. It was not affection, not yet, but a recognition of their shared predicament. He was no longer just the Comanche boy, and she, perhaps, was no longer just the white woman. They were two individuals caught in the currents of fate, beginning to learn the first, hesitant steps of a dance neither had chosen. Her internal turmoil was constant, a quiet war waged within her heart. The memory of John, of the love they shared, was a sacred, painful shrine. Yet, the demands of her new life were immediate, undeniable. She was learning to survive, not just physically, but emotionally, in this strange new world. Winter deepened, blanketing the plains in snow. The Comanche settled into their seasonal rhythms, the hunt for scarce game becoming paramount. News, carried by returning scouts, rippled through the camp one frozen evening, bringing with it the shadow of conflict. Aggressive white buffalo hunters, emboldened by the Army's campaigns further north, were pushing deep into sacred Comanche hunting grounds, slaughtering the herds with reckless abandon, threatening the tribe's very sustenance. Worse, a patrol of soldiers, new to the territory and quick to misunderstand, had reportedly fired upon a small Comanche hunting party, mistaking their intentions. Tension gripped the camp like a vice. The warriors were restless, their voices low and angry around the council fires. Takori, his face grim, listened to the heated words of his war leaders, some calling for immediate retaliation, others for caution. Sarah, now understanding more of the language, listened from the periphery of her teepee, a cold dread seeping into her. She knew the mentality of some of her own people, the arrogance, the disregard for native claims, the quick trigger fingers. She also knew the Army's often brutal efficiency once engaged. An all-out conflict would be devastating for the tribe. She saw Kachi, his young face tight with worry and a warrior's burgeoning anger, listening to his father and the other leaders. An idea, a desperate gamble, formed in her mind. She knew something of how settlers communicated, how military minds often worked, the importance of a clear show of strength, but also the potential for parley if approached correctly, if they could be made to understand the Comanche were not a random band but a unified nation defending its own. Later that night, as she and Kachi sat by the small fire in their teepee, the silence heavy between them, she spoke. Kachi, she began hesitantly, the soldiers, the hunters, perhaps there is a way to speak to them, to make them understand, without a great battle. He looked at her, surprised. They are enemies. They take our land, our buffalo. I know, she said softly. But some are just ignorant. Some can be reasoned with if they see strength, but also a willingness to define boundaries, not just fight. She explained her fragmented thoughts, perhaps a strong, unified delegation, not to plead, but to state terms, to show the Comanche were a force to be reckoned with but also capable of parley. It was a risk, a huge one. To even suggest it felt like a betrayal to some, but to her, it felt like the only path that didn't lead to certain disaster. Kachi listened intently, his initial skepticism slowly giving way to thoughtful consideration. Her words, coming from her unique perspective, offered a different angle, one that hadn't been voiced in the heat of the war councils. He said little, but the next day, Sarah saw him speaking earnestly with his father, gesturing, his voice low but insistent. Corey listened, his gaze thoughtful, occasionally flicking towards Sarah's teepee. The council of elders and war leaders convened again, the air thick with debate. Corey, after listening to all, finally spoke of Kachi's relay of Sarah's counsel. The idea of sending a delegation, not to fight but to parley from a position of strength, to clearly delineate their territory and the consequences of further encroachment, was met with initial disbelief by some of the more aggressive warriors. Why talk when they could fight? But others, older and perhaps wiser to the growing power of the white man, saw the potential merit. Sarah's input, relayed by Kachi, suggested specific ways to approach this, how to make their presence known without immediate aggression, how to potentially use one of the few traders who spoke both languages as an intermediary. It was a strategy that acknowledged the enemy's mindset, something none of them fully possessed. Ultimately, Corey, respected for his shrewdness as much as his bravery, decided to attempt this cautious path first, while still preparing for conflict if it failed. A carefully chosen party, including Kachi and some seasoned warriors, but also an elder known for his measured words, was dispatched. Sarah waited, her anxiety a cold knot in her stomach. Days stretched into a week. Then, the delegation returned. There had been no bloodshed. They had encountered a small army patrol and, through a tense but ultimately successful parley facilitated by a reluctant trader, had managed to convey to Corey's message, this was Comanche land, and its violation would be met with unified resistance, but they sought peace if their boundaries were respected. The officer in charge, surprised by the organized and articulate nature of the Comanche stance, agreed to relay the message to his superiors. The buffalo hunters, hearing of the army's caution and the Comanche's resolve, became warier, their incursions less bold for a time. A fragile, temporary peace had been bought, partly through Sarah's unexpected insight. There was no open praise for her, but a subtle shift occurred in the camp. Glances were less hostile, more curious, some even tinged with a grudging respect. Corey himself, in passing, met her eye and gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was more acknowledgement than she had ever received. Her relationship with Kachi had also changed. They had faced a crisis, and her counsel had proven valuable. A new level of partnership, born of shared concern and mutual reliance, began to replace the awkwardness between them. It was not the passionate love she had known with John, but it was a bond, solid and real, forged in the crucible of their joined destiny. As Sarah looked out from her teepee at the Comanche world, a world that was slowly, painstakingly becoming less alien, she felt a profound transformation within herself. The sharp edges of her grief for John remained, but they no longer defined the entirety of her being. She was Sarah, the widow from the lonely cabin, but she was also something more now, a woman who had found an unexpected strength, a surprising resilience, and a precarious but real place in a world she had been forced into, but was now, in some small way, helping to shape. The future remained a vast, untamed prairie, full of uncertainty, but she faced it not with despair, but with a quiet courage and a hard-won sense of belonging. The dawn that broke over the camp seemed, somehow, a different dawn. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell.